Good evening, and thank you all for joining us tonight. As always, I'd like to thank our friends of Corrales Library Group for sponsoring our Zoom Pro platform. And it is a privilege to have with us Jennifer Hull, who is a writer and teacher of K through 12 students, as well as freshman university students at UNM. And Jennifer grew up in New York and graduated cum laude from Cornell University and is the author of Shook, an earthquake, a legendary mountain guide, and Everest's Deadliest Day. I also want to mention that Shook won the Zia Award and also won the NMPW Communications Contest in the Biography History category. So congratulations, Jennifer, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me tonight. It's just such a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Sandra. This is the book. It's called Shook. And the first chapter is entitled Camp One Everest, and it begins with an excerpt from the New York Times from April 25th, 2015. We're coming up on the 6th-year anniversary of this. So the New York Times wrote, more than 25 million years ago, India, once a separate island on a quickly sliding piece of the Earth's crust, crashed into Asia. The two landmasses are still colliding, pushed together at a speed of 1.5 to 2 inches a year. The forces have pushed up the highest mountains in the world in the Himalayas. And here's the beginning of the chapter. In the vast bowl of the Valley of Silence, 4 canary yellow tents sat in a row, perched on a narrow fin of glacier, like birds on a wire. Dave Hahn, the lead guide of the 2015 RMI Everest expedition, and his assistant guide, JJ Justman, were in the second tent. Beside them, clients Robbie Massey and Peter Rogers shared the first tent. On their other side, Sherpa Sardar, cheering Dorje, and client Himanshu Parwani, HP as he liked to be called, listened to tinny Nepali music playing from an iPhone in the third tent. They had just crawled wearily inside of their nylon shelters, their heads throbbing from the oxygen deprivation hangovers of their first night at 19,689 foot Camp 1, thirsty and exhausted from their successful morning rotation to 21,000 foot Camp 2. Moments earlier, they had crossed quivering metal ladders over deep crevasses, scraping their crampons on the frozen metal as their gloved hands clutched thin ropes on either side. It was 11:56 a.m. on April 25th, 2015. Dave was wiggling out of his climbing harness and JJ was bent over a camp stove, melting snow to make tea, when they felt the ground move in waves below them. Dave froze. At nearly 20,000 feet on Everest, he suddenly felt like he was in a boat on the ocean. He and JJ glanced at each other and at the same time said, "Earthquake." All 8 of the climbers instinctively shot their heads out of their 4 tents, but socked in by the weather, they could see nothing but snow falling and a dense gray fog as the ground below them rocked. "What is this? Dave, what's going on? Is this normal?" shouted HP from his tent. Then above them, they heard a roar of cracking ice. Avalanches began to rumble downward, echoing in the bowl between the mountains that amplified sound like an amphitheater. The ground jolted and dropped. In the first tent, Robbie Massey remembered what he had said to his family when they expressed concern about the 2014 icefall avalanche. "Lightning doesn't strike twice," he had told them. "Oh my God," JJ blurted. Dave took a mental inventory of the situation. Mount Everest was shaking like jello. He and his team were camped between 2 crevasses and below 3,000 foot high towers of ice. Avalanches thundered down every mountainside around them. He found himself considering whether it would feel better to die from an avalanche off of the peak of Nuptse or from one off of Everest's west shoulder. During those brief seconds of assessment, which stretched out in slow motion, he also took stock of the possibilities that the ice shelf on which they were camped could collapse out from under them, or it could break loose and slide 3,000 feet down into the icefall. "It's an earthquake," he heard himself shout, "but we're all right." "Zip up your tents and stay inside them," cheering instructed. "Get your helmets and transceivers on." The bewildered team obeyed, sliding on their helmets and strapping on their transceivers as they stared wide-eyed at their tent mates. HP's hands trembled while he set his beacon to transmit mode. The roar of snow and ice grew louder and closer. Robbie and Peter grappled with tent zippers flapping wildly in the wind as they contemplated their own deaths. Cheering thought of his wife, pregnant with their first child. The ground below them shook violently, swaying and popping. Before they could manage to zip all their tent flaps and vents shut, they were hit. So that is the first chapter of the book.
Wow.
Thank you, Jennifer. What an amazing story. Can you tell us about your motivation to write this book?
Yeah, I'd love to. You know, it's a nonfiction story. It's a completely true story about the 2015 earthquake that hit Nepal. And when I taught 6th, 7th, and 8th grade up in Taos, Dave Hahn, who is the guide featured in the story, and probably the world's most coveted mountain guide. He's summited Everest more times than any other non-Nepali. He would come into my classroom and to visit with my students, and I actually have the book that he brought one of his visits. He would do slideshows for my students in the class, and this was just as his career was really beginning to take off as a professional mountain guide. He was on the team that discovered Mallory's body, and that was documented in this book called The Ghosts of Everest. And it, you know, the disappearance of Mallory and Irvin in 1924 really kind of was this mystery, and remains so actually in the mountain climbing world. But he would come and, you know, and give slideshows of these kinds of expeditions with my students, and it was just wonderful because, you know, I had 7th graders, and it was riveting to them, and it was just great to have something that was so enthralling for them. And we designed curriculum around it, and we'd use those little visits as sort of a springboard for all kinds of things in the classroom. At the time, what I really would have loved was a narrative nonfiction vehicle. You know, like that's what I attempted to create here with Shook, that my students could have read along with that curriculum. We read Into Thin Air at that time, which is an amazing book, but it was a little sophisticated in terms of, for an entry level mountaineering book, it was a little different than what I would, you know, than what would have been ideal for them, but it was still, you know, it's a fabulous book. And over time, I just kind of kept watching Dave's career build and grow, and became interested in Everest as a result, you know, myself, and watched the era sort of shift over time there. And I just kind of became really interested in it. When the earthquake hit in 2015, and Dave was there after a really significant career, you know, over decades at that point. It just seemed so like the end of a particular era to me. And I found this story really compelling because, you know, of course, he's a personal friend and a friend of so many in Taos. And to get that news over Facebook that he was safe after the earthquake, when we knew he was guiding up there, was it, you know, he was at Camp 1 when the earthquake hit with his group. And I just felt there was a story there that really needed to be told of the expedition, and also of his career that had been built over time. And so we went out to breakfast at the Taos Diner, and we talked about it. He's a wonderful writer, so I thought that perhaps he'd want to write he writes often for, you know, Outside Magazine, National Geographic, and I thought maybe he'd be ready or at a phase where he might be interested in writing his book, but he didn't want to. He was very reverent about the tragedy. He didn't want to profit from anybody's loss. He really wanted, and bottom line was he wanted to climb more than he wanted to be writing a book. So I asked him for his permission to try to, you know, give it a go myself. As I became sort of more and more obsessed with the story, it just wouldn't let me go. And he very kindly sort of like allowed me into it. It was a real honor to write this story, and he hooked me up with people in the world of Everest to do the research, because it was all based on primary, almost, I mean, there was a lot of other research too, but there was a lot of primary research and interviews with everybody on the expedition, with his Sherpa Serdar, who is just an amazing person, and his co-guide, JJ Justman. And so that's how it's, in the meantime, I had been writing, and I'd been teaching writing, and I hadn't ever attempted or even imagined writing a book. But all those forces kind of collided at the same time. And I decided to just take a leap and give it a go.
Well, I'm glad you did. It was a story that was needed to be told. And you did a great deal of research on this book. How long did you work on completing it? And were there any surprises in your investigative writing?
Yeah, it was years. I mean, it was probably about 4 years in total, writing the book, researching it, and writing it. I had never written a book before, so I was trying to teach myself how to do that at the same time as doing all of the research. And there was so much that was surprising about the research, and it just kept me really enthralled with the story as I was trying to see the bigger story come through the research. For instance, this character, Miss Elizabeth Hawley in the story, who was a gatekeeper essentially for this, climbing community. She was just a force to be reckoned with, and I was really, really, I had the huge honor of being able to interview her through her assistant, who ended up taking over the Himalayan database that is basically just a compilation of Miss Hawley's records over 50 years of data keeping, based on interviews with climbers before they would leave for Everest and after they would get back. And just the amount of scientific research that she had accumulated, like for instance, the fact that Everest is really almost blind to gender in terms of success, failure, making it, summiting, death while trying to summit. Gender doesn't, while many fewer women climb Everest, the rates are very similar, men and women. However, something that was revealed, through her records was that Everest is not blind to age at all. So age was a much bigger factor in success and death rates and such, so on, than gender. I think a lot of the surprising things were female pieces of the story, because most of the stories that I've read about Everest or about climbing have been written by men. And they're just, even the cultural pieces and the goddesses of the Khumbu Valley, who are said to inhabit, these different mountains. I just found a lot of the female components of the culture and of the base camp doctors are mostly women. I found that really new and interesting to me. I hadn't learned much about that before. So that was surprising. It was also great for me to learn what happens sort of behind the scenes as a guide, because whether as a Sherpa guide or as a Western guide, just the amount of responsibility and decision making, and just the sort of the technical logistics of how to conduct an expedition as a guide. Some of that was surprising to me. I love kind of seeing what goes on behind the scenes with people in their professions. And yeah, I mean, I could probably go on and on about things that were surprising, but I think probably, yeah, that the female characters in this story were probably what I knew the least about before doing this.
Well, I loved your book. I think each decision that was made on that day had such an impact. It was interesting the way you brought that about and wrote it and developed each of the characters. Um, I think now we're going to open it up to anyone else who has any questions for Jennifer. I know Cynthia's lived in New York as well, who's here tonight, and she's read your book. I know. Chris,
I
did you?
finished reading it last week, Jennifer, and I thought it was really wonderful. I love reading books about Mount Everest and seeing movies about it. And your book, I thought, was a very fresh perspective on all of it.
Thank you.
I also liked how you brought in the wife who was left behind.
Yeah, Nomita. She was a wonderful character. It's when I was interviewing HP, he kept bringing up, you know, things that his wife had said or that his mother-in-law had said, and I was like, oh my God, I've got to meet got to meet her. And he set up an interview, and I was just fascinated with her side of the story. And to me, that was just an interesting part of the decision making that goes into these expeditions, what you're leaving behind, what you're choosing to leave behind. I mean, HP, for instance, was so moved by his father's struggle with cancer. And I think it just made him just determined to fulfill this dream. But the hardest part was leaving her and the boys. And she was just, she's just like this fierce, wonderful, warm character. And she didn't have any romantic notions about this climb or about Everest at all. But she supported him in it. And thank you for, you know, I've never, in all the Zooms I've had, we've never talked about that particular chapter. So I appreciate you saying that, because I didn't know if that resonated for other people, but it did for me. Was her story and her perspective.
Jennifer, I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Jennifer, have you done any summiting at all yourself? Are you a climber?
No, you know, Dave and I both worked at Taos Ski Valley. I was a ski instructor there for a few years, and he was a ski patroller there. When he first moved to New Mexico, he first started as a ski instructor at Angel Fire, but then he quickly went into patrolling and came over to Taos, and I taught there for a few years. And I love to hike, but I am by no means a mountain climber. It's just not something that I do. I mean, in any way more than totally casually. And that was a big obstacle to me, sort of emotionally, because I didn't want to feel like a fraud talking about, you know, this career and this climbing when I really wasn't an expert in it by any means. I had plenty of friends who were climbers. I was in a community of people who were skiers and mountain climbers. But it wasn't something that I had experience in. And, you know, in some ways being an outsider was surprisingly helpful, because I think I had maybe a fresh lens to the experience. But at other moments writing it, I really would have liked to have been a mountain climber.
Right. Yeah.
And I wished I could have written this story, obviously, from first person. You know, to have been on that expedition would have been the way I felt to ideally tell that story. And that's probably also why I was encouraging Dave to consider it. But then again, third person sort of freed me up to brag about him a little bit, you know, to sort of contextualize his accomplishments in a way that I don't think he would have felt comfortable doing. So yeah, I would have preferred to have some more, at least have done one kind of mountain climbing expedition, have some experience under my belt.
To get that feel what the other people are feeling.
Exactly. But using the blog, one thing that was really lucky is that Dave has kept 20 years of essentially journal entries through these blog posts he's done for different. My dog is click-clacking through the room. And so I had just 20 years of material to draw from in terms of, the mountaineering experience. And being able to interview everybody else firsthand was really helpful in getting a sense, especially some of the climbers who weren't as experienced, who were going just to base camp. Bonnie, for instance, who really, was never, she was just trying to get to base camp and back. I appreciated their perspectives because it was a range of different levels and experience levels in the group. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Jennifer, I'm a little embarrassed to say we've been here 40 years in New Mexico and had never heard of Dave Hahn. And so I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of background. Just is he a native? How did he get here?
Yeah.
That type.
He's a very modest about his accomplishments and lives, kind of a quiet lifestyle in Taos. He's still a ski patroller at Taos Ski Valley. He came out here after college. He was born in Okinawa, then in California, then in New York, upstate New York. And he came, his mother was originally from New Mexico, and his mother passed away when he was a child from cancer. And he always had fond memories of New Mexico, particularly the Albuquerque area, hiking in the Sandias with his uncles and that kind of thing. And he was always trying to figure out how to get back to New Mexico. He couldn't kind of piece it together for college to do anything like that. But after college, he took the car that his grandmother in New Mexico had given. He had inherited from his grandmother, and he ended up driving across the country and coming back. He posted, he was looking for an apartment. He posted something at UNM on like the bulletin board, and he ended up starting in Albuquerque, going up to Angel Fire, where he got a job as a ski instructor and then as a ski patroller. Then he went to Taos, and he just fell in love with mountain guiding and ended up kind of on a worldwide circuit, essentially, and worked his way up in the profession. His dad had been a mountain climber, and helped prepare him, helped sort of set him up with the training he would need, kind of with, okay, if you start here on this mountain, then you'll learn how to do this, and this, and then you can get a job here, and sort of helped him carve out a path, because once he saw that people could actually make a living as mountain guides, he was, sold on that idea for sure. And his career just really took off after he began climbing Everest. Kilimanjaro and a lot of work in Antarctica. Up until the time of this expedition, he was just sort of on this worldwide circuit that included Everest every spring and patrolling in Taos, for a couple of months. He was really only here about 2 months of the year. The rest of the time he was always a working guide. He never was summiting mountains just to summit. He was always working as a guide. He ended, and then he surpassed, he broke the record while guiding of summits on Everest, which is always, it's sort of a tricky record because it's really ethnically qualified, when you think about it, to say that, well, he's climbed Everest more times than any non-Nepali, essentially meaning any non-Sherpa, So in terms of Western guides, he's climbed it the most. And, as we know, and as Sherpas finally get some of the credit that they've always deserved, Sherpas have climbed Everest there more. So that's a very, very minimal synopsis, but he's been here since then, and he still has a house in Taos and still lives and was stuck here during COVID, more than he would normally be.
Like all of us.
Yeah, but he's up in Alaska right now where he's guiding. He's very humble, very modest, but he's very well known in Taos because he's very community minded and does these great slideshows and, like I said, comes into schools and
Yeah, that's great.
Helps people out with fundraisers and that kind of thing. Very, very beloved up in northern New Mexico for sure.
Well, thanks.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
Has Dave said anything about retiring? Because in the
I'm
book, he's already 53.
Right, yeah, no, not
2015.
exactly. He is not, I've never heard him use that word. I'm not sure. We have to ask him, I guess, but I don't want to speak for him, but he hasn't guided Everest since 2015. That was a real kind of turning point. In the story it said that he felt like he got bucked off of Everest, that year, and he didn't like that feeling very much, but he's gone back to guide treks to base camp as fundraisers for, I think the last one was for the Juniper Fund. But he has not guided on ever since, but as the rest of the circuit, he continues to guide again up until COVID, and hopefully that'll all get back in action again. But yeah, I've never heard him use the word retire.
Well, it's just because age is such a factor. And
it is. Yeah,
venture.
it really is. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Well, maybe he'll break that record too. Maybe he'll be the oldest guide.
Right. Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I mean, even there's a lot about him sort of facing that in the story and looking back to when he was first guiding and thinking, I'm gonna have to know when to get out. Because so I think that's different for different mountains, maybe.
Yeah, that would make sense.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Another question came in through chat. Mary's asking, did you have to quit your day job when you were writing this?
I did quit my day job while I was writing this. We moved to Albuquerque during that time for other reasons. And it's ironic because I was living in Taos, which is pretty quiet up there, but having never lived here before, this kind of became my cabin in the woods. And I was able to I dove 100% into it, thanks to my husband who supported us, during that time. We were going through some different health things came my family's way during that time. So that became sort of a job in and of itself. But I had like the incredible gift of being able to just commit myself fully to the book and to the research and to the writing, which I had never done before.
Wow.
Did you get to travel while you were doing that, or did you do it on FaceTime and things like that?
Yeah, mostly FaceTime is how we did it. Almost all of the interviews were FaceTime. Yeah, lots of phone calls, lots of FaceTime. Yep. And I'm just thinking back to some of the, my son was having surgeries in Colorado, and we were kind of going back and forth there. So that was like the traveling I was doing, but it wasn't anything great.
No.
Yeah. Yeah, so no, thank goodness for technology. That was mostly how we were doing this. Also, Dave's been part of some just really beautifully documented expeditions from National Geographic, and Eddie Bauer has funded some of these. And so there was a real treasure trove of video, not necessarily of this expedition, but of past expeditions where I could look at, for instance, Lukla, or at a stop on the way up to base camp, and really lay eyes on it and hear it and see it. So all of that video footage was really helpful for me too. Yeah, I'd love to go.
It was also amazing how you were talking about what a money-making venture it is for the country of Nepal, and for all these, all the money and resources that go into these climbs was rather astounding.
Yeah, and their economy has really struggled. I don't know if you've paid attention like to Nepal at all during the COVID year, but it's been really a trying time for a country that so relies on this sort of tourist income. And it's a tricky balance because there's this whole criticism of it's a fragile economy or a fragile environment, sorry, and a fragile economy, but a fragile environment, obviously in the Khumbu Valley and where they're going. And people are often really vocal about how the tourism is too much on the environment. However, the locals in the valley are really eager for the climbers to come because it helps them survive, and the lodges and the tea houses and the Nepali-owned climbing companies, there's an entire industry that's been built around this, and they really rely on these tourists to come in, whether to trek or whether to climb or just as sort of everyday tourists. It's been very hard on Nepal to not have this in their economy this year.
You made a big point about how the Sherpa people use a lot of this money to educate their children.
Yeah. Cheering. That's actually, that's sort of what I have on tap for my next project, is really focusing on his perspective. I found his story to be extremely compelling, and he is really almost typical of so many people in the area who live in these tiny, remote, high altitude villages, have grown, from a very agricultural heritage of, pastures, farmlands, yaks, potato farming, and they all of a sudden, these communities, all the men went and became climbing Sherpas on Everest, because you could make more money in one season on Everest as a climbing Sherpa than in a decade, doing what they were doing. And in Shearing's village, for instance, most of the women became widowed as a result and ended up having to support their own families. Shearing, his father had died when he was 2 years old. And so his eldest brother was responsible for looking after the family. He had already left to become a monk in India, but he returned home, left his career as a monk, and in order to support Shearing and his brothers and sisters and mother, he just jumped right into, he found a job as a climbing Sherpa because he knew he could make enough money to support them. He sent Shearing to a very nice private school in Kathmandu. He was very proud of the fact that he was able to, support his brother in that way, so that his brother wouldn't have to enter the same profession he had been forced to enter as a Sherpa, a climbing Sherpa. And he and then his brother, when Shearing was in high school at that school, his brother was killed while Sherpaing in an avalanche, and therefore Shearing gave up his dream of becoming, he was thinking either, maybe medical school, maybe he'd become a software engineer. He was just starting to dream about those things in high school, and he was thrust into the profession. So it's a little bit of a catch-22, but Shearing's doing very well for himself and became just steadily professionalized in the field. I mean, he was thrust into it totally unprepared, with no climbing experience, no training whatsoever, and became what was called a kitchen boy on a Japanese expedition to Tibet, and kind of earned his stripes when he ended up summiting the following year on an expedition. And he says, as soon as you kind of get Everest on your resume, you're good. You have a job for as long as you want. But he became really he took advantage of every training available and became steadily professionalized as a guide. Now he lives and works in Canada, where he has 2 beautiful daughters and a safer job. But yeah, you see generations of people in these villages trying to use the Sherpa job to kind of get to the next rung with their children, and sometimes, have to fall back into it to keep it going. It's really fascinating to me.
It was good they went on strike after 2014 and got more pay and more life insurance for
I
themselves.
thought so too. It was a real, labor. It was just essentially a labor dispute and a strike, and they shut down Everest. And I think that was great. When Dave went in 2015, he was concerned that because of that happening in 2014, where so many people Sherpa workers had died in the ice fall from that in the beginning of the season, which closed down the season. He was concerned because the Sherpas and the guides are just so intimately connected and their lives depend upon each other. And he didn't know if their relationship had been sort of irrevocably fractured because of those tensions. Mm-hmm. But he was very pleased, I think, and relieved to find that was not the case. And then, they had other problems with the earthquake, but that wasn't it. I think that there was a lot of people were gratified in the Sherpa community that they had done that and that the government had responded. And they really did get most of the concessions, which were really basic, that they had asked for and demanded, essentially. Yeah.
Another question has come in through chat. Mary's asking, at what point did you have a publisher for the book? Did you have to sell it to a publisher, and was it a hard sell?
Well, that was a whole other part of this ballgame that I had never, come up against. That was challenging. I thought that I was writing this book in my mind, I was writing this book for my students. So I thought that this book was YA, young adult nonfiction, when I was writing it. In fact, I had used the young reader adaptation of Boys in the Boat as kind of a model of how to build this thing. And so I started querying young adult agents, and I was getting a lot of interest in the story, but the common people were requesting the full manuscript, which was great. But the feedback I ultimately was able to sort of digest was that this did not fall into the YA category simply because the protagonist was a 50-something-year-old man. A YA nonfiction would follow somebody maybe 19 or 20. Mm-hmm. And he was that age for a portion of the book, but not for the majority of the book. So I kind of changed my focus, and I went to a conference here in Albuquerque that was hosted by UNM to meet with 8 people, trying to sell your book. And I ended up meeting Stephen Hull of the university, who's not related to me, even though we have the last name. And he, I met him, enjoyed talking with him, and I sent him the manuscript. And he made an offer right away, but said he didn't want to market it as a YA book. He wanted it to be general nonfiction. He thought that it would have a wider audience of, armchair enthusiasts to people, to climbers, across the board. And I'm really grateful for that, because that has been the case. I've gotten feedback from people from 9 to 99 who the book has resonated for on, different levels. And I'm glad that it wasn't confined to a specific audience. So yeah, that was really tricky. It was hard. And I was really, really happy to get that offer, because this book has its roots in New Mexico. Dave's mother was so important and influential for him, and New Mexico it's really where he fell in love with mountains. So it felt like it had found its perfect home. I also liked that it was a university press, and that the book was going to be upheld to certain, university press standards and be really vetted based on that. So I was very happy to get that offer. And it's not an easy profession. I've learned there's a lot of competition, and it's a changing publishing landscape. So I felt really fortunate to get that offer when I did.
There's another question from Chris. I've heard there are tons of equipment left on Everest. Did Dave share his perspective on the environmental impact of the climbing community?
Yeah, there is a lot of stuff left on Everest, and as global warming impacts it more and more, and as the layers sort of peel back of ice, and more sort of old pots and pans and things from long ago expeditions appear. Dave didn't focus too much, in my discussions with him about any of that, but I definitely do in the book, particularly just the way the global, he really watched the surface of Everest change over his career there, because of the warming temperatures. And yeah, a lot's been uncovered as a result. There's a term in the book called goraking that he uses, because the goraks are those big black birds that soar around the Khumbu, and he calls it goraking. He loves to hunt for old oxygen bottles from historic expeditions and things like that, and he calls that goraking. So in his house, he's got some of those things that he's found up there. But yeah, the government has instituted policies over the last decade where expeditions have to bring back a certain amount of trash, and otherwise they're charged a really hefty fine. They actually pay a deposit, and then they get that back if they bring down actually more pounds of trash than they create during an expedition. It's an incentive to clean up the mountain, and that seems to have been working pretty well.
Thank you. Well, are you planning to write another book?
I am. I don't know if I'm just a glutton for punishment or what, but no, the cheering was such a fascinating part of this story for me that I don't feel like I'll be totally done with this project until I follow that thread to its end. So I've been interviewing him a lot weekly to just research more about him and his life and his story. And then we'll see what comes of that. But I'm just beginning. That's only recent that I've plunged back in, because even marketing a book has been new to me. Just doing. Of course, COVID changed all of that. There was no real book tour or anything like that. That was supposed. The things that typically happen. But the Zooms and all of that's been wonderful. But that has been a whole new experience and a learning curve in and of itself. So yeah, now I'm really eager to write again, get back at it, and ready to be, alone in my office. It was so many years alone writing this thing. That's been nice, to be with other people and talk about it and hear from people about it. But now I'm eager to write again.
Wonderful. Well, I'm looking forward to your next one.
Yes.
Yeah. And congratulations on this one. I think it was a real achievement.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah, it was a real privilege, real honor to just be able to give it a shot. And it's really been just a lifeline for me in a lot of ways too. So it's been a great experience. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jennifer, thank you for sharing your book and sharing all of the insight and information. I'm so grateful that you could join us tonight for our author series. And does anyone else have any more questions or comments? Mary's saying thank you so much in the chat.
I want to know how that cod turned out with the capers.
Right, that sounded delicious.
It really did. Oh, there she is. I can't hear you though.
I think she's still muted.
I'm back. It was delicious. I cooked it on a bed of kale with Mediterranean tomato sauce. I was fascinated by this, and I am so grateful that you have opened your home to come to us and give us a presentation of your book. I think all of us are yearning for connections
Yes.
that we've not been able to have over these last 11, 9 months, 11 months, whatever it is. Seems like forever.
Yes.
And that you're willing to share your experience of this.
Oh my gosh, that's my joy. I could talk about this project forever, Thank you, though. I love the community that has come up around it. I've also been shocked and delighted by how kind other New Mexico authors have been in sort of welcoming me. James McGrath Morris, I don't know if you've read any of his work.
Yes.
But
yes.
oh my gosh, he has just basically offered himself up as a mentor as I've been trying to navigate this new world. And it's just such a wonderful community. The bookstores have been fantastic and just so kind and supportive of authors and readers. So yeah, the community has been wonderful for me too, particularly during this time. And I've just been so, it's just a beautiful, lovely group of people like you guys and everybody who I meet in these things. And the story, is a little bit of escapism, as we're stuck and not able to travel and to, kind of maybe go around the world in our minds for a little while. I know it has been for me.
Well, and I'm also grateful that the libraries are taking up and picking up the gauntlet and saying, okay, how are we going to do this? All right, we're all going to learn.
Yes.
And bringing you to us when we cannot be there in person.
It's so amazing. And this is my first library Zoom, so I'm really honored to be here. It's wonderful. I grew up with an incredible public library in New York called the Emma S. Clark Library. It's on Long Island and in East Setauket. And it's still a refuge for me, when I'm visiting my parents. I love that library. I'm a huge fan of libraries, and this book community has just been such a gift during this time. So thank you for being here.
Well, thank you. And you'll have to come visit our Corrales library once.
I can't wait to get my library card.
We're open by appointment now.
Yeah.
And thank
Sandra,
all of you for being here tonight.
Thank you, Sandra. It's wonderful, as always.
Yes, thanks,
Thank you,
Sandra.
Jennifer.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all for joining tonight.
Sandra. It's so nice to meet you.
Be safe.
Please come back next month for our author series where Dennis McCarthy will be talking about his book, The Gospel According to Billy the Kid.
Oh, sounds good.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye.